On the morning of April 14th, 1992, in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, citizens flooded the steps of the House of Justice, anxious for a glimpse of the accused killer, Andrei Chikatilo. For months, newspaper headlines had branded him the Red Ripper, or the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo was dressed in a souvenir Olympic sports shirt provided by the court. His head had been shaved, a standard procedure to guard against lice. As proceedings began, the setting resembled a circus more than a murder trial.
He was in a large iron cage in the courtroom. The cage was to protect him from the rage of the parents of the victims.
He was never able to sit at a table and converse with his lawyer the way a Western defendant would have been. It was a bizarre scene. In the public seating, you had a number of family members of victims who were quite vehement in their desire to see him executed. And if they had had the option of seeing him executed by having wolves tear him apart, they would have voted for that.
The victim's parents' reaction was understandably strong. When he was put in his cage, people rushed towards it and shouted, "Give him to us!" But how else would you expect the parents who lost their children to behave?
On the opposite end of the courtroom, Justice Leonid Akopjanov presided, flanked by ordinary citizens, the Russian equivalent of the Western jury. The judge read the list of charges. The volume of evidence filled 222 casebooks. The story they told was grim and horrifying in its details. The victims' ages varied from 9 years old to 45. They were both male and female.
If the ultimate point of the sexual act is to create life, Chikatilo's idea of it was that it should climax in death. So he was Mr. Anti-Sex, Mr. Anti-Life.
It took 2 days for the judge to read through his list of indictments. On April 16th, the defendant was allowed an opportunity to address the court. Families of Chikatilo's victims screamed insults. Some fainted. In a rambling 2-hour statement, Chikatilo described himself as a man robbed of his genitals. Born impotent, Chikatilo claimed to be cursed by a lifetime of sexual frustration that had eventually driven him to murder. He asserted that he had never planned to kill, but that he had been seized with shaking and shivering and had lost control.
He seemed at various times intent on proving that he was crazy. At some points that I witnessed, he jumped up and started shouting at the judge and then dropped his pants and exposed himself. At other times, he started cursing and screaming and so forth.
Most observers believed Chikatilo's behavior in the courtroom was an act, an effort to gain sympathy. If found criminally insane, Chikatilo could be placed in a psychiatric hospital. If judged sane, however, he faced execution. In Russia, that meant a single bullet to the back of the head.
The definition of sanity and insanity from the legal point of view, which is an international definition and was used in the Soviet Union, was can the person in question tell the difference between right and wrong?
The trial would continue for 6 months. Throughout, Chikatilo presented himself as a wretched victim of nature's indifference and a gruesome metaphor for Russia's 70-year failed social experiment.
When he was defending himself, he blamed Stalin, he blamed his parents, he blamed the cannibalism of the famine, he blamed the Communist Party, and he even blamed his own blood type.
Prosecutors would argue that Andrei Chikatilo was in fact the most calculating, diabolical killer of all time.
His crimes were sickening, but I don't think he was sick in the psychiatric or legal sense. Certainly not insane. He was more bad than he was mad, and he was certainly very crafty, but he wasn't crazy.
October 14th, 1992 would signify the day of reckoning for serial murderer Andrei Chikatilo. It had taken nearly 2 months for Judge Leonid Akopjanov to write his final verdict.
Everybody knew he was going to be convicted. Everybody knew what the sentence was going to be. But there was, I guess, some value in going through the ritual.
Учитывая чудовищные злодеяния, что он творил, судебная коллегия не может не назначить ему единственное наказание, которое он заслуживает, исключительную меру наказания, и приговаривает его к смертной казни.
After a 12-year murder spree, final justice came swiftly. On February 15, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was escorted through the halls of Rostov prison and led to a private cell. There he was executed by a single shot behind the right ear. In the aftermath of his execution, writers, reporters, and victims' families attempted to find some trace of humanity in Andrei Chikatilo. But in many ways, this man, who committed extraordinarily cruel crimes, remains an enigma.
He spoke himself of some of his motivations, and yet when you hear any single explanation, it never rings with sufficient truth to explain the hideous crimes that this man committed.
Having seen the dead bodies of so many victims, it may have seemed natural for me to hate him. And that is what I felt until Chikatilo was finally captured. At that point, I realized that Chikatilo wasn't in control of what he was doing. He was a very sick person, acting against his will.
Whether you believe that he was the victim of the circumstances under which he was born, or whether you believe he was an evil person who used free will to do what he did and wanted to kill, that evil that grew in him is not something that's alien to all of us.
Perhaps the final judgment on the life of Andrei Chikatilo was written by the killer himself, an expression of guilt and self-loathing that at the same time hints at his gruesome, violent nature. And now my brain should be taken apart, piece by piece, and examined, so there wouldn't be any others like me.